So we'll try a slightly different angle. This is the lab and the animal room as a backdrop. Pretty much from the view of where I would normally sit, except I'm gonna sit across from where I would normally sit, just to give you something more interesting behind me than just a chalkboard with a line almost through the middle of my head. Gonna walk you through the evolution lab. All this paperwork is posted on Blackboard. And basically, what I'm going to do is very quickly walk you through the bits and pieces. You have an answer sheet to put answers down on. I'll take you through the questions for it. You have the questions for it. That went by too fast. And then you have a part 2 with questions on it. Depending on how long this video runs, the part 2 I may put on a separate video. But I don't think so. I think we can go through this fairly quickly as I kind of walk you through what we're all doing. Remember from class that evolution is a change in populations. I'm going to get a little bit less of the ceiling in this, and I'm going to sit down a little lower. Change in populations over time as a response to the environment. In a changed environment, you can get extreme changes in the population. In a stable environment, you get changes, especially as different organisms come and go from the conditions. The conditions are the same, but you get a brand new predator into the area. Conditions are different. The part 1 questions are all about the conditions that our ancestors changed in response to. Prior to about 3 million years ago, Africa was rainforests, almost top to bottom. And then way off to the west, you know the continents drift around, right? Well, North America and South America had a little bit of a fender bender, and a bridge rose up between the two, Panama and southern Mexico. And the circulation of the oceans, which just used to go straight through between North and South America because it was open in between, now changed patterns. So the curtains come across the Atlantic, bounce off of the connected continents, and then go north. Keeps England nice and cozy. England is way far north of us, but it's the recipient of a warm stream that comes from the tropics up to England. But that change in ocean circulation is also a change in water in the atmosphere. And what that did was it dried the top of Africa out. It's gradually doing it more and more. Even still, is the Sahara Desert is the most obvious example over here, I guess, on Africa, is that the top of Africa is very much dried out. And then there's a band across Africa and a little bit down on the east side that dried not to desert conditions, but to dry grassland conditions, where jungle plants no longer could exist. Is it sorted through for the ones that could resist dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet seasons, as opposed to wet all the time. So you get a lot of grass, you get a lot of scrub brushes, you get some tall trees and some short trees, but fairly well spread out. And it's a very, very different set of conditions. Keep in mind that this wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have been a very gradual shrinking of the jungles and gradual replacement of the edges as they dried out and kind of went south, and replacement by grasslands. And a lot of animals that now live in the grasslands have ancestors that were jungle animals. Some of them still have the same species in the jungles because they could adapt to both without significant changes. But some of them left on the edges, got better and better at living in the grasslands, less tied to the jungles, and eventually full-time grassland animals. So what we're gonna do is walk through a whole bunch of animals and different features that they have. And what I want from you is to give me at least one advantage that that animal has from this particular feature, and at least one disadvantage. And if you can't think of some of the disadvantages, it's really tough to come up with one. And if you can't come up with an occasional disadvantage or two, then feel free to put that down. you put it on every single one. I'm going to figure you're not really trying. But, there's a couple that are tough. And if you can't come up with anything, I totally understand that. So I'm looking down the part one questions, starting with African elephants. They're big animals. Big animals, there should be a couple of pretty obvious advantages to that. Think about big animals in the environment that they have to live in. You should be able to come up with some disadvantages. They have a weird feature. They have a trunk, a long nose that's kind of prehensile at the end. They also have, in relationship to the trunk, and you have to think about this, almost no necks. So, and we'll talk about necks later, so you get another chance to think this through. If you're drawing a blank now, when we talk about necks later, I think coming back to this may help. So come up with an advantage. Disadvantage is kind of tricky to come up with. I mean, the classic disadvantage of, gee, they'd be in a lot of trouble if it didn't work, but that's true for pretty much any feature that gives you an advantage. So it is a little bit trickier to come up with a clear disadvantage for the trunk. So think it over. If you can't, just write down you can't. I figure you tried. Elephants are very long-lived animals. Is that they have life generations almost similar to us. Now, connected to that is they tend to be pretty intelligent. Is that you see that connection between long lives and intelligence in a lot of animals, because intelligence isn't as useful to animals that are there and gone really fast, but it tends to be more useful to animals that live a long time. So you think about that, you can come up with some advantages. Now keep in mind, we're talking about living a very long time for very large animals. So you should be able to come up with, and also they take a very long time before they hit puberty and the ability to make more elephants. You think those through, you should be able to come up with disadvantages. Tusks are, literally long teeth that stick out. Pretty easy to come up with the obvious advantage. I'll mention one that typically people don't come up with, but I want to talk about conditions. If you look at elephants that evolved, or elephant relatives that evolved elsewhere, like mammoths have the curly tusks. Mastodons kind of spread out, mastodons kind of curl up. The mastodons may have preserved the advantage of the African elephants. The mastodons totally lost it. And you see that happen, where something that can be a weapon in battles for male dominance often evolved to be less than lethal. So that the two participants, you don't wind up one of them dying, you just wind up one of them giving up and backing off. The African elephants have definitely lethal tusks. They do their dominant wrestling head-to-head with the tusks sticking out, and a stumble will possibly get you killed. Even if you're the bigger, stronger one, if you stumble the wrong way, you could wind up with a tusk in your side, which could be bad. But we are talking about an area that gets dry for half of the year, and the water holes dry up to the point where you'll go to a water hole and there's no surface water. Tusks that are straight, pretty useful for that. Elephants, it's described in the lab, but the males, if they feel threatened, they're basically protecting a group, is that they come out just so far, really fast, and then stop. And stand there and open their ears and look really big and kind of turn sideways to look even bigger and make lots of noise. But it's a bluff, is that they're not intending to actually finish the charge and engage with the threat. And the question is, so what's the advantage there? And when you come up with disadvantages, think about things that elephants actually, things that could actually kill elephants. That's not a really long list to come up with a disadvantage for bluff charge. And in elephants, as in a lot of animals, the males tend to be significantly bigger than the females. So think about this specifically as it relates to male, female. Shouldn't come up with, once you come up with that, the disadvantages of the males being really big kind of goes back to the disadvantages of being big. For African lions, they live in prides, big cats, little cats, baby cats, live as large groups. Pretty easy to come up with advantages. Disadvantages, they hunt in groups. Their basic approach is to sneak up from where the wind's coming toward them so the wind isn't carrying their scent to the prey animals. And they'll kind of focus in on a group of prey animals, and when they get to one spot, they're gonna form a big circle. So they drop a couple of lions, usually the least experienced ones, and then fan out around the group, least experience, more experience, more experience, more experience, more experience. And when they get the circle completed, a lion, either the wind will have conveyed their presence there, or a lion will purposely show itself to let the group know that, hey, there's lions. Think about that strategy in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So it isn't just hunting in groups, it's this particular strategy that I want you to think about in terms of advantages and disadvantages. The experienced lions are the females. Females are the primary hunters in this. And here the main thing to think about is kind of reverse, where the advantage is more connected to the disadvantage of letting the males do the hunting. Less so, well, there's advantages to letting the females during the hunting too, when you look at the nature of the groups. The male has this big mane that if he's out and about on his own, he's not part of a group, he's been driven away for one reason or another, it doesn't grow or it drops right out. If he's had it, it drops right out. So really you only see significant manes in males that have taken over a group, they're called prides, taken over a pride, and has been there for a while. So think about that as a signal to potential challengers in terms of advantages and disadvantages. And there may be some advantages during fighting. That one's a little iffier. And then think about disadvantages. Is that, and if you think about why, if a dominant male gets driven out of a group, his mane within days just drops right out. There's a disadvantage that would be there if that didn't happen. One thing that's a little odd, male takes over a new group. One of the first things he does is he goes through the group and he kills every baby that he can manage to kill. Any of the larger ones run off because otherwise he's going to kill them. And so think about his term of office, sort of, and why there's an advantage to killing the babies or driving away the young ones, and what advantage that gives him kind of for the future. And disadvantages, because it does change the nature of the group for a while. So you think about that in terms of disadvantages. I think what I'm going to do is try to do this in a series of small videos. So we're almost up on 13 minutes with this one, so I'm going to stop this one.